The candles at the long table of Aldermere had burned down by 2 inches, and the wax had pooled and hardened into small white lakes at the base of each silver holder. Dinner was not yet concluded. The footman had brought the dessert course and withdrawn to the margins of the room, and the conversation at the table had grown the particular kind of loud that comes from 2 bottles of claret and the general confidence of a household that has assembled itself to celebrate. Cecily Vaughan sat in her appointed place near the foot of the table, which was not precisely at the foot, because the foot was where Mr. Prentice had stationed himself with the air of a man who considered himself the natural head of any room he entered. She sat 3 seats from that end, between a baronet's wife who spoke only to the woman on her other side, and a young solicitor who had not addressed her once in 4 courses. Before her, on the white cloth, stood 2 crystal glasses. One held wine, dark and untouched. One had not held wine at all, not for the past 47 minutes, though it looked as though it might. Cecily did not look at the glasses. She looked at the centerpiece, a spray of late autumn chrysanthemums in a silver bowl, and she kept her hands folded in her lap. And she waited. Mr. Prentice was rising at the far end of the table. He held his own glass, and he was smiling, and it was the kind of smile that lived in the upper half of the face, and left the eyes entirely unmoved. He said something about the generosity of their host and the pleasure of the assembled company. He said it smoothly, as a man who has rehearsed the sentiment sufficiently that it no longer sounds rehearsed. Cecily did not touch either glass. She watched him. She had known, since approximately 7:30 that evening, precisely what was in the glass that was not wine. She had known, since before, that what he was willing to do to the one woman in this house who had looked too carefully at the wrong set of numbers. The speech continued. At the head of the table, Edmund Hardcastle, Earl of Aldermere, sat very still. He was watching her. She had not looked at him directly, but she knew it the way one knows the location of a fire in a dark room, by the quality of the warmth arriving from a fixed point. She did not look at him. She looked at Prentice, and she smiled pleasantly, and she waited for him to propose the toast. She had already made her decision. She made it the moment she understood what he had done. She was going to let him make it himself. The late autumn of 1813 was not a forgiving season for a woman in reduced circumstances, and Cecily had arrived at Aldermere in the 2nd week of October with a single trunk, a letter of reference from a clergyman in Shropshire, and the specific quality of composure that belongs to women who have learned to hold their faces still while everything they owned was sold around them. Her father, the Reverend Mr. Arthur Vaughan of Ledbury, had died in August. He had died in the particular fashion of gentle, unworldly clergymen who trust solicitors implicitly and review their affairs not at all, peacefully, and leaving behind him a set of debts that consumed the parsonage, his library, the modest plate, and the 3 years of savings Cecily had understood to constitute her modest security. She was 24 years old. She had been educated above her immediate station and trained, through long practice, below her natural inclinations. She knew French, watercolor, fortepiano, and household management. She knew how to enter a room without drawing notice and how to leave one without being missed. She had come to Aldermere as companion and de facto governess to no specific child, because the Earl's ward had died the previous spring, and the position had been recast quietly as companion to the household in general, which meant in practice that she managed the correspondence Lady Hardcastle did not wish to answer, and the accounts Mrs. Breck did not have time to reconcile. Lady Hardcastle had received her in the morning room on her first day, sitting very upright in a chair of dark green silk, and had looked at Cecily the way a woman looks at a piece of furniture she has not quite decided where to place. "You will manage the household correspondence," Lady Hardcastle said, "and assist where required. You understand the position." It was not a question. Cecily said that she did. "Miss Finch is expected for a fortnight beginning Friday," Lady Harcastle said, in a tone that carried its meaning clearly. Miss Dorothea Finch, it became apparent over the subsequent days, was the daughter of a Wiltshire baronet, had a considerable income, a considerable quantity of pale blonde hair, and was expected by Lady Harcastle to resolve the question of Edmund's continued bachelorhood before the season resumed. Miss Finch's presence was not a social event. It was a campaign. To the household, Cecily was simply the governess and nothing more, Lady Harcastle had remarked to her companion Mrs. Alderton, 2 rooms distant, and in a voice pitched as though the house were empty. The remark arrived through a half-open door. Cecily filed it in the same category as the assigned seat at the foot of the table, and the expectation that she would take her meals with the household, rather than the family. She had understood her position before she accepted it. Understanding a thing and being accustomed to it are 2 different kinds of suffering, and she was in the early days of learning the difference. Gerald Prentice she had noticed at once, because Prentice was a man who required noticing. He had Edmund's height, without Edmund's stillness, a gregarious quality that occupied the room somewhat in advance of his person, and a particular attentiveness to Cecily that she recognized, after 3 days, as the attentiveness of a man who wants to know what you have seen. She had not yet, in those first 3 days, seen anything in particular. That came later. It came on the 15th of October, a Tuesday, when Mrs. Breck asked Cecily to reconcile the household accounts from September because the figures were not balancing and Mrs. Breck's eyesight had been troubling her since August. Cecily sat down with the ledger after dinner and worked through it methodically, the way her father had taught her to read a text, from beginning to end with attention to every conjunction. The figures from the household accounts were mostly correct. The figures from the estate management entries, which were kept in a separate hand, the hand that Cecily would eventually confirm belonged to Prentice, were not. The discrepancies were not large, taken individually. They would not have caught an inattentive eye. They were entered neatly, plausibly, in categories that existed elsewhere in the ledger, and the sums were small enough to suggest error rather than design. The pattern, though, was not a pattern of error. Error is random. This was systematic. It had been running, as far as Cecily could establish, for 14 months. She closed the ledger. She sat for a moment with her hands folded on top of it. Then she put it in the drawer of the writing table, and the following morning she sought out Mrs. Breck. Mrs. Breck was in the kitchen passage, directing a delivery of coal, and she turned at Cecily's approach with the expression of a woman who has been keeping a secret for some time and is not entirely displeased to be sought out. She sent the coal delivery boy back to the courtyard, and she looked at Cecily for a moment. And then she said quietly, "You found it, then?" "I believe so," Cecily said. "The September accounts." "November of last year," Mrs. Breck said. "That's when it started, near as I can tell. Mr. Prentice took over the estate management from Mr. Ashby in November." "Does the Earl know?" Mrs. Breck's face did something complicated and sad. "Mr. Prentice is very close to his lordship," she said, "since Thomas died. His lordship he's been not himself, miss, and Mr. Prentice has been very present." She paused. "I'd be careful who you tell and how, and I'd be careful what Mr. Prentice thinks you know." Cecily thanked her and kept the ledger, and was careful. She was careful for 9 days. Then Prentice came to find her. He came to the small sitting room off the morning corridor where she worked in the afternoons, and he was pleasant when he came, which was itself a kind of information. He sat down without being invited, in the way of men who do not consider that courtesy applies to their social inferiors, and he asked her how she was finding Aldermere, and whether the position suited her, and whether she had been able to make herself useful to Mrs. Breck with the household accounts. Cecily told him she had found the accounts in excellent order. Something shifted in his face. Only a small thing. The smile did not change. The quality of his attention changed, however, the way the temperature of a room changes when a window is opened, somewhere you cannot see. "The September ledger gives some trouble," he said easily. "The copying from the estate management is sometimes careless. You'd not want to confuse the two." "Of course not," Cecily said. He left shortly after. She sat in the sitting room with her hands in her lap for some time after he was gone, thinking about what he had said, and more particularly, about what he had decided not to say. The following morning, a kitchen girl named Nell was brought before the housekeeper's parlor and accused of breaking a Wedgwood teacup from the service Lady Harcastle reserved for formal calling hours. The accusation came from Prentice himself, who had discovered the broken pieces on the floor of the morning room and had retrieved them with an air of sorrowful certainty that Cecily, passing in the corridor with a basket of mended linen, found immediately suspect. Nell was 17 and had been at Aldermere 3 years, and Mrs. Breck had spoken highly of her. She was also standing at the door of the housekeeper's parlor with the particular stillness of a girl who knows that in this precise kind of dispute, her word does not weigh what the gentleman's does. Cecily set down the basket. She went in. "The teacup from that service," she said, addressing herself to Mrs. Breck rather than to Prentice, whose eyebrows had risen at her entrance, "was cracked when I last catalogued the service in the 2nd week of October. I noted it in the inventory. The crack runs from the handle to the rim, on the left side, here." She indicated on her own hand where. "A cracked teacup set in a cold morning room will complete the break eventually, particularly if the tray is set down on an uneven surface." Mrs. Breck's face was careful and attentive. "The morning room chimney has been drawing cold for a fortnight," Cecily continued. "I understand a mason has been contracted for the work. In the interval, the room has been cold enough most mornings to leave frost on the inside of the lower panes." Nell was not breathing. Prentice said pleasantly, "Miss Vaughn, I don't think household management quite falls within the scope of your position here." "Perhaps not," Cecily said. "But accurate accounting does. The inventory is in the household records, dated and signed. I am happy to produce it." She did not look at Prentice when she said this. She looked at Mrs. Breck. There was a silence of several seconds. Then Mrs. Breck said that Nell might return to her duties, and said it in a tone that foreclosed further discussion. And Nell went. And Prentice remained in the doorway for one careful moment before he also went. And Cecily retrieved her basket of linen from the corridor and continued on her way to the 2nd floor. She did not know, because she did not look behind her, that the Earl was standing at the far end of the corridor, in the shadow of the gallery door, where he had stopped when he heard voices. She did not know that he had watched the entirety of the exchange from that distance. She did not know that he stood there for some time after she disappeared up the stairs, with his face open in the way it was never open in public, with an expression that a man does not permit himself when he believes he is being observed. 3 days after that, Edmund came into the library at 7 in the morning and found Cecily there, which was not where she was expected to be. She was reading, because she rose before the household, and the library was warm, and she had run out of reasons not to use it. He stopped in the doorway. His face was the face she had learned to read in 5 weeks of observation, the face that gave nothing away as a matter of discipline rather than as a matter of vacancy. She began to rise. He made a brief gesture with one hand that indicated she need not. He went to the shelves at the far end of the room. He took down a volume she could not see from her angle. He sat in the chair by the window, which was the chair furthest from her, and he read. They did not speak. The fire burned. Outside, the November morning came up gray and cold over the Aldermere grounds. After some 20 minutes, he said, without looking up from his page, "You were a clergyman's daughter." It was not precisely a question. "Yes," Cecily said. "Ledbury, I believe." "Yes." A silence. "My ward, Thomas, was fond of Ledbury. He'd spent a summer there with his mother's family." Cecily said she was sorry. She said it in the particular way she had learned to say it over the past months, without excess, without the falseness of an emotion borrowed to fill a space. She said it as a plain thing, because it was a plain thing. She was sorry. Thomas, whose portrait hung in the upper corridor alongside a child's wooden horse propped against the frame, had died at 9 years old of scarlet fever in April, while Edmund was in Brussels. Edmund turned a page. His jaw was very still. "He was a good boy," he said, and said nothing further, and Cecily did not press him. And they sat together in the morning quiet until the household stirred and she excused herself and went to take her breakfast alone. What she had not seen, because she did not turn her head at the door, was Edmund setting down his book and watching the space she had occupied for a considerable time after she left. The proximity between them in subsequent days was not sought. It simply occurred, in the unremarkable way of things that have a logic of their own. He came into the morning room when she was at the writing table, and he stood at the window reading his correspondence, and they occupied the same room without ceremony. She came to the library in the evenings with her mending, and he was frequently there. And they read in silence with the fire between them, which required no explanation from either party. She was aware of him in the specific physical way she had not been aware of anyone in a long time, the way the body maintains a private map of the room and refreshes it without being asked. She knew where he was when he moved. She knew the sound of his step in the corridor outside a closed door. She knew, without looking up, when he stopped reading and looked at her instead, because the quality of the room changed, the way the quality of the air changes before rain, and her hand on her mending would slow without her instructing it to. One evening in early November he said, from his chair, without preamble, "You are cold." She was cold. The fire had burned down, and she had not wished to ring for more coal at that hour. "I am perfectly comfortable," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the gray eyes that she had stopped being able to classify as merely cold. Then he rose and put more coal on the fire himself, which was not the sort of thing the Earl of Aldermere was expected to do in his own library, and which he did with the unceremonious competence of a man who considers the task requires doing, and therefore does it. She kept her eyes on her work. There was a warmth in her face that had nothing to do with the fire. "Thank you," she said when he sat down. "You should have rung," he said. It sounded like a criticism. It was, she had begun to understand, something else. The grammar of a man who registers when something should not be so, and says so, and means by it that he would prefer it otherwise. She did not say that she had not wished to trouble anyone. She said instead, "I will, next time." He looked at her a moment longer than necessary. Then he returned to his book. She sat with the warmth on her cheeks, and her mending in her hands, and the fire bright between them, and she did not look up, and neither did he, and the evening went on in its pleasant and bewildering way. The dinner party at which Prentice had planned to end Cecily Vaughan's position at Aldermere, and by extension her only remaining situation in the world, had been arranged 3 weeks in advance. It was to celebrate, ostensibly, the anniversary of the late Earl's accession to the title. It was to include the Wiltshire baronet, Sir Frederick Finch, his daughter Dorothea, and 12 other guests of standing. Cecily had known about the dinner. She had not known about the glass. She had known about the glass for 47 minutes as the footman laid the table and the guests assembled in the drawing room below, because she had gone to the butler's pantry at 6:30 to verify the placement cards, and she had seen Prentice alone there for less than a minute, bending over the tray that held the dessert wine service, and she had watched him straighten and leave, and she had gone to look, because Prentice's attentiveness had been teaching her things for 6 weeks. The glass was in the position Cecily's placement card designated. The others held wine. This one did not. She lifted it. She was not a physician, and she could not name what she held. But she had lived her whole life in a clergyman's household, and she knew the smell of laudanum, which her father had taken for the headaches that plagued him in his final year. It was present here, concentrated, masked under something sweeter she could not identify. She understood what it was intended to do, which was not harm, only humiliate, only make the governess behave in a public setting in the way that would end her, confirm every small dismissal she had already absorbed, give Lady Hardcastle the occasion to thank her for her service, and show her the door. Cecily stood in the pantry with the glass in her hand. She thought of Mrs. Breck's face when she said Prentice was very present. She thought of the ledger in the writing table drawer, with its 14 months of patient systematic theft. She thought of what a man who has done that will do next, and the next time after, and the next time after that, if no one holds a light to it. She poured the contents of the glass into the drain behind the sideboard. She poured wine into the glass until it matched the others. She set the glass in the position from which she had taken it, and then she moved it 3 inches to the left, to the position that corresponded to Prentice's placement card. She moved the card with it. She was still standing in the pantry, arranging the last detail of her composure, when she heard steps in the corridor. Not the quick step of a footman. The deliberate step of a man who has come looking for a specific person. Prentice opened the door. He stood in the frame of it, and he looked at her, and the easy smile was absent. What was in its place was something she recognized. The face of a man who has run a calculation and arrived at an answer he does not like. "The accounts," he said. "I beg your pardon?" Cecily said. "Whatever you have found in the accounts," he said. "Whatever you think you understand. I'm telling you, Miss Vaughan, as plainly as a man may tell a governess and nothing more, that you are in a position that is easily ended. Lady Hardcastle has been looking for a reason these 6 weeks." Cecily kept her hands still at her sides. Her heart was moving faster than she would have preferred, which was information for herself and no one else. "Your position here," Prentice continued, "depends entirely on the goodwill of this household. A young woman of no family, no income, and no connections, who makes accusations against a member of the family on the basis of some figures she fancies she has misread, will not find a second position easily. You understand me?" "Perfectly," Cecily said. He looked at her for a moment, assessing. "The accounts will look after themselves," he said. "Your business is the correspondence and whatever else Lady Hardcastle requires. It would be wise to remember that." He left. The door swung behind him and settled in its frame, and the pantry was quiet again. And Cecily stood in it for a moment, with her breath even and her hands still, and the quiet, particular anger of a woman who has been told what she is and what she is worth, and who has decided that the person telling her is precisely wrong. She thought of Nell in the corridor, standing with that particular stillness. She thought of Thomas, whose portrait faced the wall of the upper corridor. She thought of Edmund in the library, sitting across a fire from her in the early mornings, turning pages with a careful patience that she had begun to read without intending to, as the patience of a man who had been waiting a long time for something he was not prepared to name. She drew a breath. She smoothed her gown. She went upstairs, put on the white empire gown she had pressed that morning, and came down to dinner. If you are still following Cecily, you know something she has not allowed herself to consider, that the man at the head of the table has been watching her for 6 weeks with the specific attention of a man who is trying not to notice something he has already noticed. Leave a thought in the comments if you know what she does not. She sat down and she folded her hands in her lap, and she waited for Prentice to make his toast. The toast came at 20 minutes past 9. Prentice rose at the foot of the table, and he was polished and warm and at his ease in the way of men who believe the situation is entirely under their management. He thanked his cousin for the hospitality of Aldermere. He thanked the assembled guests for the honor of their company. He looked down the table at Cecily as he said this, and the look was brief and pleasant, and Cecily met it with the same pleasant composure she had been practicing since October. "To Aldermere," Prentice said, "and to those who keep it so admirably." He raised his glass. The table raised theirs. Cecily raised hers. Prentice drank. She watched his face. The smile held through the first swallow, as she had expected it would. It held through the second, though something flickered at the edge of it. Some brief recalibration, as though a calculation had produced an unexpected result. By the time the conversation around the table resumed, he had set the glass down and was looking at it with an expression Cecily found, in some private region of herself she would never name aloud, almost instructive. He did not rise to speak again for some time. The next 20 minutes were the longest of Cecily's life at Aldermere. She ate the dessert course with careful attention. She replied when addressed. She watched Prentice from the limit of her peripheral vision and noted, without visible reaction, the progressive stages of a man whose composure is beginning to lose its footing. By 10 o'clock, he had excused himself from his chair twice, the second time returning to it with an unsteadiness he attempted to attribute to the wine. By 1:15, Sir Frederick Finch had broken off a remark to look at him with direct concern. Miss Finch had stopped speaking altogether and was watching him with the expression of a woman who has observed something she cannot yet classify. The baronet's wife, whose name Cecily had not been given in 5 weeks, said, in the tone of one who considers herself above making observations, and then makes them anyway, "Mr. Prentice, are you quite well?" Edmund had not moved. He sat at the head of the table, with his face still and his gray eyes on Prentice, and whatever he was thinking did not cross his face, but the quality of his stillness had changed. It was no longer the stillness of a man who is waiting for dinner to conclude. It was something else. Cecily placed her hands on the tablecloth. She drew a breath. Then she reached into the pocket of her gown and set the household ledger on the white cloth beside her dessert plate. The baronet's wife saw it first. Then Sir Frederick. Then, one by one, the attention of the table shifted. Edmund looked at the ledger, and then he looked at Cecily, and for the first time in 6 weeks his face changed entirely. She said, her voice low and even, addressing him directly, "The estate management accounts, my lord, from November of last year through September of this." Gerald Prentice made a sound. He had risen halfway from his chair, and the attempt at authority had not quite arrived in his posture, and it was visible to everyone in the room that something had gone profoundly and irreversibly wrong with the evening he had planned. "That ledger," he said, and his voice had thickened, "is household property, and she has no business," he began. And then he sat back down, heavily, because the effort of the sentence had cost him something he did not have. Edmund rose. He did not speak immediately. He looked at Prentice for a moment with the expression Cecily had learned to read, the expression that meant the calculation was complete, and then he looked at the solicitor 3 seats from her end, a young man named Mr. Hewitt, who had said nothing to Cecily all evening, and who straightened now with the sudden attentiveness of a man who understands he is about to be needed. "Mr. Hewitt," Edmund said, "I would be grateful if you remained after dinner." Mr. Hewitt said that he would. Edmund looked down the length of the table, not at Prentice, at Cecily. He walked the length of the room. The candles were still burning. The chrysanthemums were still in their silver bowl. The table of 14 people was entirely silent in a way that candlelit dinner tables are rarely silent, the way silence falls when something has occurred that no one yet knows how to speak of. He stopped beside her chair. He did not look at the ledger. He looked at her. "She is not the governess," Edmund Hardcastle said, the words level and clear. "She is my intended." Miss Dorothea Finch set down her glass. Lady Hardcastle, at Edmund's vacated end of the table, had not moved. Her fan was in her hand, and it was not moving, which was itself a kind of information for those who knew her, which most of the table did. Her eyes went from Edmund to Cecily, and then to the ledger, and then to Prentice, who was sitting with his hands flat on the cloth, and his face doing something difficult and private. Edmund held out his hand to Cecily. She had not known he was going to do it. She had not known. 6 weeks, 4 days, and 1 morning in a library, that it would come to this particular moment, this particular gesture, in front of 12 witnesses and a silver bowl of chrysanthemums. Her hand was in her lap, and it took it half a second to find his. And when it did, the warmth of it was not what she had expected, which was everything. She stood. The table was still watching. She was composed because she had spent 24 years learning to be composed under observation, and she was not, for the first time in 5 weeks, invisible. Prentice left Aldermere the following morning, under the supervision of Mr. Hewitt and 2 of Edmund's senior tenants, with the household ledger as evidence and a letter from Edmund's solicitor in London that had been dispatched before dawn. The matter would be resolved through proper channels, Edmund had told Cecily, when the guests had gone and the house was quiet. Prentice would not be permitted to simply withdraw. There were 14 months of estate funds to account for. And Mr. Hewitt had found, in the course of an hour's work that evening, 3 additional sets of accounts that bore examination. Cecily said quietly, "He delayed your journey to Brussels." Edmund had gone very still. "In the spring," she said, "the letters that told you Thomas was well, the ones that kept you 6 weeks past your intended return. I found the correspondence copies in the estate files, filed under routine post. There was no correspondence from Thomas's physician in that period, only Mr. Prentice's summaries of what the physician had allegedly said." Edmund sat down. He sat in the armchair by the empty drawing-room fireplace, and he put his hands on his knees, and he looked at nothing in particular for long enough that Cecily thought he might not speak again that evening. Then he said very quietly, "Thomas died on the 9th of April." "Yes," Cecily said. "I arrived on the 14th. "I know." A long silence. The house settled around them in its night sounds, timber and wind, and the distant last movements of the kitchen. "I thought," Edmund said, and stopped. "You were not responsible," Cecily said, and she said it plainly, the way she said things that mattered, without decoration. "You were given false information by a man who stood to benefit from your absence and your grief. The responsibility is his. You came as soon as you believed you were needed." Edmund looked at her. The firelight was low, and his face was open in a way she had not seen it. The careful composure gone entirely. the jaw no longer held at that controlled distance from feeling. "You have been in this house 5 weeks," he said. "Yes. You found all of that in 5 weeks." "I found numbers that did not balance," Cecily said. "That was all. And then I looked where the numbers pointed." He said nothing. He did not look away, and neither did she. And in the firelight of the empty drawing room at Aldermere, in the late November quiet, something passed between them that did not require words, and was, perhaps, better served without them. It was not until she rose to take her leave that he spoke again. He rose as she did. She turned to go, and he spoke her name. Cecily. Her name in his voice. Her given name. It was the first time he had used it, and she felt it land in her chest the way a bell note lands, vibrating after the strike. She turned. "Stay," he said. Then, with something that was almost correction, almost tenderness, "Stay at Aldermere." It was not a declaration. It was not the speech she might have imagined. In some guarded interior she rarely allowed to speak. It was 6 words, in his level voice, and it was the most precise thing she had heard in 5 weeks. She said she would think on it, because she was a woman of some stubbornness, and because she believed people should be asked, rather than managed, even by men she had decided she trusted. And Edmund received this with the particular grace of a man who recognizes that a direct challenge from the right quarter is not an obstacle, but information. Lady Hardcastle came to Cecily's small sitting room 2 days later, in the morning. She sat in the chair across from Cecily's writing table, and she was, as she always was, impeccably upright, her silver hair dressed correctly, and her dark plum morning gown without a wrinkle. She sat for a moment without speaking. Then she began. "I was told, some weeks ago, by Mrs. Alderton, that you were simply the governess and nothing more. I am afraid I agreed with her." Cecily waited. "I have been reconsidering," Lady Hardcastle said. She looked at the hands in her lap, which was, for Lady Hardcastle, the equivalent of a considerable disclosure. "My son has not looked at anyone since Thomas died. Not as a man looks when he believes the looking signifies something real." She paused. "He looks at you." Cecily did not speak. "Miss Finch was a sensible arrangement," Lady Hardcastle continued. "But it was mine, not his. There is a difference, I have been informed, between the two." Her chin lifted very slightly. "Mrs. Breck informs me that you have been very good with the household since October, and that my son has been sleeping more soundly these 6 weeks than in all the spring and summer past. I am choosing to draw my own conclusions." She rose. She moved to the door, then turned. "My son will ask you formally," she said. "I would be grateful if you did not make him wait too long. He is not good at waiting. He was not as a boy, and he is not now." Cecily said she would bear it in mind. "Good," said Lady Hardcastle, and left. And Cecily sat for a moment looking at the closed door, and then she laughed, a small and quiet laugh, the first real one in 5 weeks, and it surprised her, which made it more real. Edmund asked her 2 days after that. In the library, in the morning. When the fire was lit, and the frost was on the grounds, and the room smelled of paper and oak, and the specific quality of winter light that enters through old sash windows at an angle. He was holding the household ledger. He held it out to her, which she did not immediately understand. And then she did. And it was his way of saying that he had seen her, specifically, and not the convenient fiction of what a governess might be. She took the ledger. She held it. The leather was worn at the corners, and the spine had a small crack from being opened too many times too quickly. "I should like very much," Edmund said, the words careful and unornate, "to give you something that does not require such careful watching." She looked at him. He was watching her with his gray eyes, and they were not the cold eyes she had catalogued in October, closed and composed against the weather. They were open, and the opening was a form of courage she recognized, because she had been practicing it herself, the courage of standing still when you could more easily depart. "What would you give me instead?" she said. "Aldermere," he said. "If it would suit." She told him it would suit very well, and the morning went on, and the frost began to melt in the pale winter sun outside, and there was no grand ceremony to it, only the two of them in a library with the fire cracking and the cold light coming through the windows and the ledger between them on the desk. Closed at last. Its accounts settled. The Christmas at Aldermere that year was the quietest in many seasons. Snow came on the 23rd of December, light at first and then in earnest, and by the morning of the 24th, it lay on the grounds and the ha-ha and the stone gateposts in the particular even way that makes a familiar landscape briefly strange and new. Inside, the fires were lit in every downstairs room, and the smell of pine and warm wax moved through the house, and Mrs. Breck had overseen a Christmas pudding of considerable ambition. Cecily sat by the window in the small sitting room that had been, since November, specifically hers, in the way rooms become specifically a person's not by assignment, but by habitual return. The window looked north, over the kitchen gardens, and the snow was still falling in slow, thick flakes that dissolved as they touched the glass. She had the ledger on the writing table beside her. Closed, its accounts delivered to Mr. Hewitt, and the appropriate matter in progress. She had not looked at it in 3 weeks. Edmund came in without knocking, which had ceased to startle her. He sat in the opposite chair. He said nothing for a time, which also no longer startled her. Thomas's portrait had been moved, at Cecily's gentle suggestion. From the upper corridor, where it had hung in a kind of exile, to the small gallery off the entrance hall, where the late Earl's portraits hung, among them the people of Aldermere, who were loved and claimed and spoken of with warmth, rather than with the silent, specific grief of things put out of sight. Edmund had not said anything when the portrait moved. He had stood in the gallery for some time on the morning Cecily arranged it, and then he had come to find her in the sitting room, and he had said simply, "Thank you." It was the most he had said about Thomas in all the months she had been at Aldermere, and it was precisely enough. She looked at him by the fire, at the familiar composed lines of his face, at the small relaxation around his eyes that she had learned to read as the expression he permitted himself in rooms where only she was present. "Happy," he said. It was not the word she would have expected from him, which made it exactly the word. She considered it. Outside, the snow continued to fall on the Aldermere kitchen gardens and the stone gateposts and the gravel drive, and the fire crackled beside them. And somewhere in the house, Mrs. Breck was giving instructions that carried faintly through the walls. "Considerably," Cecily said. He put his hand over hers on the arm of the chair. Not with formality. Simply. The way a man puts his hand over something he has decided is his to keep. The snow went on falling outside the window, quiet and persistent, covering the grounds of Aldermere in white, and the candles burned on the writing table, and the ledger sat closed beside them, and this was sufficient. It was more than sufficient. It was the whole thing. If Cecily's quiet courage moved you, leave a thought below. Thank you for staying until the end.